Sagittarius. They awaken God's wrath. No peace until you're removed. Dear Sagittarius, this is not just a message, it's a mirror. A sacred reflection that appears not to frighten you, but to awaken you. Somewhere in your life, someone stood close, not to celebrate your fire, but to quietly absorb its warmth as if it were theirs. They didn't shout. They didn't wound you with cruelty. Instead, they leaned in with softness, with stories, with silence. And slowly you began to wonder if your joy was too loud, if your presence was too much. But your soul has always known. Even when you couldn't explain it, you could feel it. The weight, the dimming, the way your light had to shrink just enough to keep peace that never truly belonged to you. And now the veil lifts, not to shame anyone, but to return you to the version of yourself before you made space for what never made space for you. In this journey, you will not be asked to blame, only to see, to feel, to remember, because what was taken from you was not your power, it was your permission to hold it openly. If your chest already feels something shifting, if your breath deepens as you read this, you're ready to take back what was always yours. Stay with me until the final word, because the truth at the end of this journey may not only shock you, it may finally set your soul free. And if this message touches something inside you, like it's been written just for this moment, please like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to Zodiac Wisdom, because here your fire is not too much. It's the beginning of everything. Gate 1. She didn't curse you, Sagittarius. She silently fed on your light. Sagittarius, this didn't begin with betrayal. It began with a smile, a familiar presence, a gentle voice that entered your orbit, not with intention to harm, but with an unspoken hunger she never named. And that hunger, whether it wore the face of a friend, a sister, a mentor, or even a mother, never asked for your light. It simply took by staying close enough long enough to make you question whether you ever had it. She didn't need to wound you with words. Her strength was subtler, offering help at just the right moment, asking you how you are while never really listening, offering stories that centered her pain while dimming yours into the background. And you, dear Sagittarius, with your wide-open spirit and your instinct to believe the best in people, welcomed her in, again and again, until one day, you noticed the light in the room didn't feel like yours anymore. You stepped back, not once but repeatedly. You gave her the floor. You quieted your joy. You swallowed your victories, because every time you celebrated something, she grew smaller. And though she never asked, your soul started carrying the guilt. You began measuring your words, your laughter, your growth. You became smaller to protect her from feeling invisible. But Sagittarius, who protected you? In Buddhist teachings, there is a truth that attachment does not always look like hatred. Sometimes it wears the face of distorted love. She wasn't envious outright. She didn't scream. She simply hovered, with just enough sadness in her story to make you feel selfish for shining. And over time, the questions crept in. Am I too much? Do I need to dim down to stay loved? Is it safer to be less? You didn't notice it happening, not because you were blind, but because you were loyal. Sagittarius is the sign of the seeker, the eternal believer in light, truth, redemption. You saw her wounds, and instead of turning away, you turned inward. You gave up your space in the light so hers wouldn't feel so dark. But something inside you was never fooled. Something always whispered, "This is not love. This is sacrifice dressed as loyalty." And now that whisper is becoming a voice. You may feel exhausted after being around her, not because of conflict, but because your essence has been carrying both your fire and her shadow. You may find yourself second-guessing joy, minimizing achievements, or holding back your opinions, not because they're unworthy, but because someone near you learned how to shrink you with their silence, not their words. That's not paranoia. That's your intuition returning to the surface. She didn't take your light with a curse. She studied it. She absorbed it. And then she mirrored it back just enough to keep you wondering if it was still yours. But light cannot be divided like that. Real light expands. It does not require someone else to shrink for it to shine. And yet, how many times did you step aside, Sagittarius? How many times did you ask yourself, did I go too far? When all you were doing was finally standing tall. You once thought love meant making room for everyone. But now you're being asked to make room for yourself. To ask without shame, who did I make smaller so they could feel whole? And more importantly, who taught me that my joy was something dangerous? In Buddhism, the greatest illusions are not the loud ones. They are the quiet compromises we make in the name of peace. You gave her more than space. You gave her the right to dim your fire. But today that permission is revoked, not in anger but in sovereignty. Because the truth is, you were never too much. She simply never learned how to stand in her own light. And now that you're remembering that truth, the next step will not just name the person, it will name the pattern. And once it's named, it can no longer remain hidden. In Gate 2, we will uncover why this was never about a single person, but a lineage of energy you were born to break. Gate 2. Her name was never just a person. It was a pattern you were born to break. Sagittarius, you thought it was just her. That one name, that one woman. Her presence still echoing in your memory like a half-remembered dream. It flashed inside your heart like a warning, and yet you pushed it away. No, it couldn't be her. But your soul knows. It always has. Because what you felt wasn't just about one person. It was about an entire pattern your spirit came here to recognize, unravel, and rise beyond. That name you whispered in your mind? It was never only about the face, the voice, or the specific stories. It was the embodiment of a role. An energetic script passed from one life to another. From mother to daughter, sister to sister, friend to friend. It is the archetype of the one who makes you feel that your worth is tied to how much you're willing to sacrifice. How quiet you're willing to become. How many wounds you're willing to carry without ever bleeding in public. Sagittarius, your fire was never meant to be a torch for someone else to hide behind. You weren't born to be the shelter for souls who refuse to build their own foundation. And yet, how many times have you found yourself being the strong one, the forgiving one, the one who understands, even when your heart is bruised and your voice goes unheard? This is not just about one woman. She is merely the most recent face of an ancient cycle. Maybe she was your mother, who never apologized but always expected your empathy. Maybe she was your sister, who cried louder so your pain would seem dramatic. Maybe she was that friend who demanded your loyalty but never protected you when the silence in the room turned cold. Or a colleague who masked competition as mentorship. No matter who she was, the pattern was always the same. You must shrink so they can remain comfortable. This is how energetic inheritance works. Not through blood but through repetition. You've played this role before. In other lifetimes, other bodies, other names. The peacekeeper. The emotional caretaker. The silent warrior. You believed that if you loved hard enough, if you gave enough, if you made yourself small enough, they would finally see you. But you've begun to realize they saw you from the beginning. They just chose not to honor what they saw. And now you no longer have to carry the legacy of women who refuse to do their inner work. Sagittarius, you are not the karmic dumping ground for unprocessed grief. You are not the healing station for every person who doesn't want to change. You are not a lighthouse built to guide those who insist on sailing blind. You once thought silence meant maturity. But silence, when offered to those who feed off your light, becomes betrayal. Not of them, but of yourself. You weren't born to be palatable. You were born to be whole. And wholeness will always disturb those who only learned how to love pieces. Ask yourself gently, who was the first person who taught me I had to be smaller to be allowed to stay? What early belief did I swallow that said, if I forgive enough, they'll love me? If I'm patient, they'll change? If I don't ask for too much, I'll be safe? In Buddhist philosophy, karma doesn't end by fighting it. It ends when someone finally wakes up. And Sagittarius, you are the one who awakens. The first in your energetic lineage to say, I will not continue this story. I return what is not mine. I am not a container for another's denial. You're not abandoning her, you're releasing her. You're not blaming her, you're refusing to carry her shadow. And that is the most sacred act of love you could offer both yourself and the lineage that shaped you. From this point forward, your story shifts. Not through punishment, through presence. And in the next gate, we begin the ritual. Not with incense, not with anger, but with the gentle yet unstoppable declaration that you are no longer the one who must suffer to keep the peace. Gate 3, the ritual of refusal. When Sagittarius returns to the light. Sagittarius, your healing doesn't begin with candles, mantras, or temples. It begins with one sentence. One sentence you've never dared to speak aloud. Not because it wasn't true, but because you thought saying it would unravel everything you've tried to hold together. And you were right. It will. But only the parts of your life that were built on shrinking. This is the beginning of your return. And it starts like this. I no longer carry what was never mine. You don't need an altar, beloved. You are the altar. Your soul is the sacred ground where lifetimes of loyalty, guilt, silence, and survival have gathered like dust. And now your fire, long muted, deeply ancient, rises not to destroy but to purify. You used to whisper, "It's okay," as your heart cracked quietly beneath the surface. You used to say, "I understand," even when that understanding strangled your joy. You forgave her over and over, but you never forgave yourself for staying too long, for bending too far, for dimming too much. But today you stand in a vast inner field at dusk, the horizon glowing gold like a farewell kiss. You're not surrounded by anyone, no audience, no judge, just you and a name that once held power over you, a name you've been afraid to speak, not because it's cursed, but because it once defined who you thought you had to be. Could be a family member, a teacher, a friend, partner. Whoever she is, you don't call her name with rage. You call it with clarity, and with a heart that still carries the echo of every silenced moment. You say, "You no longer belong to me. I release you, forgive you. I choose myself." And something shifts, not dramatically, but surely. The air around you softens, as if the universe has been waiting for you to say those words for lifetimes. The heaviness in your chest, that pressure you thought was just how life feels, it lifts slightly like a fog beginning to burn off in sunlight. This is not revenge. This is resurrection. Buddhist teaching says when you are struck with an arrow, you must pull it out. Not question the shooter. Not wait for their apology. Just remove the pain. And Sagittarius, you are finally ready. You pull it out not to punish but to live again. You understand that peace isn't a reward. It's a right. And it has always been waiting for you, just on the other side of your refusal to keep bleeding for someone else's comfort. Can you feel that breath, the one that feels just a little easier than the last? That is your rebirth beginning. You once thought you were born to heal others, but healing was never your only purpose. Freedom is. And today you remember that. You are not a vault for inherited pain. You are not a diary for another's unspoken grief. You are not a holding cell for guilt that doesn't belong to you. You are the light. And light doesn't ask for permission to exist. So close your eyes now. Speak her name softly once. No need to shout it. Then let it float away on the breeze, into the dark, into the stars. And as it goes, feel what remains. The warmth, the clarity, the stillness, the truth. You are Sagittarius. You don't belong to anyone's shadow. You belong to the fire that never stopped burning beneath everything you forgot. And in the next gate you will finally ask, without her story inside me, who am I now? Gate 4. When the story ends and Sagittarius begins. Now that she's gone, Sagittarius, who will you become? This is the sacred question your soul has been whispering since before you were born. Not in moments of glory, but in the quiet aftermath, when you finally stopped shrinking for others and found yourself standing at the edge of a life that no longer fits. You've carried her story for so long, not just her wounds but her expectations, her voice, her fear. And for years you thought you needed her blessing to be radiant. But here you are, no blessing received, just your fire, still burning, still yours. There is no applause when peace arrives. It does not knock. It does not shout. It waits, silently, patiently, for you to stop asking for permission to feel joy. And now, Sagittarius, you have stopped asking. You've put down the mask, the one that smiled when you were aching, the one that agreed to be the strong one in rooms filled with silent blame. You've removed the role, the good one, the forgiver, the responsible one, the light bearer for everyone but yourself. You've laid it down with grace. No drama, just a quiet knowing. That chapter is closed. What replaces it? Stillness, freedom, and a question. What does your life look like when you no longer need to be edited to be accepted? You begin to walk, not to escape, not to prove, not to convince, but to be. Your joy doesn't ask for approval. Your peace doesn't beg to be understood. Your laughter no longer needs to be quiet. This is not rebellion. This is restoration. Sagittarius, you once thought you had to earn rest, had to deserve stillness, That only when everyone else was healed, only when no one else was upset, would you finally be allowed to exhale. But the truth is that exhale has always been waiting inside you. And now it begins to flow. A breath of fire. A wind of freedom. A silence that no longer suffocates. It soothes. You look at yourself. Not through her eyes, not through their disappointment, but through your own. And what do you see? Someone whole. Someone kind. Someone powerful in ways words could never name. And you realize she wasn't afraid of you because you were wrong. She was afraid because you carried a light she could not control. And now that light no longer bends. No longer hides. No longer dims. You are not too much. You were never too sensitive. Never too radiant. Never too free. You were just never meant to fit into places built by people who feared the very fire you were born to embody. So now ask yourself again, who will I become when I no longer have to apologize for choosing joy? That is the question you'll answer not with words, but with the way you rise step by step into a life that feels like home. And in the next and final part, Sagittarius will return to the center, to gather all the pieces to bless the fire, and to close this chapter not with an ending but with truth. Conclusion, you were always the light. Dear Sagittarius, you have walked through every threshold of this journey with courage that didn't always roar, but whispered steadily in your soul. I'm ready to come home to myself. This was never a story about her. Not really. It wasn't about the name that stole your light, or the wounds that tried to convince you to shrink. It was about you, and your quiet, relentless return to a truth deeper than any memory. You never lost your fire. You only tucked it away, hoping it would make you easier to love. But what you've now remembered is this. You were never meant to be small. You were never meant to soften yourself to make others comfortable. You came here to be a torchbearer, a truth speaker, a guide for those still trying to find their own light. You do not need permission. Not to rest. Not to rise. Not to begin again. The woman you once couldn't name. She didn't curse you. She only awakened what was already trembling inside you. Her shadow was the contrast that made your light undeniable. And now that light doesn't ask. It leads. So if your soul feels even one breath lighter, if your heart whispered yes as you read these words, then you've already begun. You are already walking in the direction of the life that was always meant for you. Let this be your vow. I no longer carry what is not mine. I no longer shrink to survive. I no longer ask to exist. I am the light. I remember who I am. I return to myself. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these words echoed something deep within you, please like, share, and subscribe to Zodiac Wisdom. Not because we seek numbers, but because healing is a collective fire. And when one of us remembers, we all begin to rise. I'll meet you again in the next layer of light. Until then, may your path be warm, free, and fiercely yours.